Aleppo. Rami Khouri is a senior fellow at the American University of Beirut. He joins us here on set in Doha. What do you think is really going on here?
Well, what's really going on at one level is the continuing give and take between Russia, France, and the United States on what to do in Syria to try to find a ceasefire, a temporary arrangement, humanitarian corridors that both sides can agree on. What's really going on behind that, though, is a much bigger battle in which Russia is reasserting its role in the Middle East, which has been there for decades and decades, but is now getting stronger. And the Russians are basically sending a message to the West, whether it's to Kerry or to Holland, that they will not be pushed around and played around with like the powers play around with the local players in the Middle East. So this is a very clear indication from the Russians that if the French want to talk about a ceasefire resolution, they have to sit down and negotiate with the Russians and do it on equal basis in a way.
When you talk about doing it on an equal basis, what do you make of the window into Hollande's thinking that we seem to get? When he was being interviewed on TF1 domestically in France, he seemed to be saying two things. One, I've thought about this a lot. Okay, that was off the back of trying to word the UN resolution, and they knew it was going to be vetoed by the Russians anyway. That was always going to happen. But the other thing seemed to be, I have to adopt the moral high ground here because I simply cannot meet Vladimir Putin and not only talk about Syria. We've got to have that conversation, and singularly only that conversation.
Right, and I think this is a throwback to the old colonial ways of the Western powers, that they can determine what goes on in the Middle East, even with the big powers that they're negotiating with. And it's also, Hollande talked about the ICC, International Criminal Court, holding people accountable for war crimes. And he's talking, of course, about Russia and the Syrian government. So the Syrian president the Russian president is not going to walk into a meeting with Hollande after Hollande just said, we're going to think of sending you to the ICC. Kerry said the same thing about some of the things in Syria maybe need to be investigated for war crimes. And so this is the bigger battle that's going on. They cannot agree on Syria. Okay. There's no way they're going to agree.
They don't agree. There is a bigger battle, of course. But when Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin says we're not going to have that meeting, even if there are other meetings in a week or 10 days, Rory Challens was telling us there might be something being choreographed as we speak. Does this make Putin look weaker or stronger or perhaps angry that he said, no, I'm not going to have that conversation?
I think if you look at that relationship with the French and you look at wider events in the Middle East, I think it makes Putin look stronger in the eyes of most people. The Russians are expanding their base in Syria. They just said they're going to expand their base in Egypt. They're talking to the Iranians. They're talking to others in the region. The Egyptian-Russian relationship is expanding. So I think this is part of a wider strategy for the Russians. And one day it's Kerry, one day it's Hollande, and it could be somebody else. And their relations with the Turks, now the Russians and the Turks. So this is a major push by Russia to reestablish a serious regional presence for itself, economically, energy, military, and politically.
Rami Khouri, as ever, thank you very much.